To master 80% of camera settings you need as a photographer, you only need to learn about 3 settings. But these settings are not just technical terms, they are creative choices. So understanding why to use certain settings is just as important as understanding how to change them to become a better photographer and creative. So after watching this video, you'll not only know how these settings impact your photos technically, you'll also know how to use your settings to execute any photography style that you want. Also, this video is part of my beginner photographer series where I teach fundamentals of photography and creativity that I wish I'd learned from the very beginning when I started out 5 years ago. So if that sounds like you, I'd appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. And that being said, let's get right into it. Okay, firstly, your camera needs light to capture photos. And the fundamental settings that impact how your camera captures light are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And these are also referred to as the exposure triangle, because changing one of them often means that you also have to adjust one of the other two as well. But aside from brightness, they also impact the sharpness and the quality of your image. So if you mess up one of these settings, you'll often have a photo that is either super grainy or blurry. And in 90% of the time, the reason your photos are blurry is because of a slow shutter speed. So let's start with that. So shutter speed is measured in seconds or fractions of a second, like 1 second or 1/100, which is 1/100th of a second. And to understand how it impacts the brightness of your photo, think about it like this. When light enters your camera, it goes through the lens, past the camera shutter, onto your camera sensor. And shutter speed describes the amount of time it takes from you pressing the shutter button to the shutter button closing. And your photo is taken in between that moment. So when you're taking a photo with a speed of 1/1000, your photo is taken in 1/1000th of a second. So quite fast and very little time for the light to hit the sensor, meaning very little light comes into your sensor with a high shutter speed. On the other hand, if you use a slower shutter speed, like 1 second for example, the light has 1 whole second to hit your camera sensor and your photo is taken during the entire 1 second. That means a lot of light comes in. But aside from brightness, shutter speed also impacts how your camera captures movement, meaning a very high shutter speed freezes movement, making it look super sharp when it comes to movement, and a slow shutter speed emphasizes the motion, making it look kind of blurry. And this blurry effect is called motion blur. Okay, all that is nice to know, but what is actually the right shutter speed for you? And I mean, the answer is it depends, but whenever I choose my shutter speed, I ask myself a question, and that is, do I want to freeze motion or do I want to emphasize the motion? So if I want to emphasize the motion, making it look kind of blurry, I use a slower shutter speed, for example 1/30th of a second or a little below if I'm shooting handheld. Okay, if you want a deeper dive into slow shutter photography, I've got an entire video on that I'll just link in the description. Now on the other hand, if you want to freeze motion, you can use a higher shutter speed, like 1/125 for example is what I consider the minimum for freezing things that are moving at a walking pace. For example, in street photography or portrait photography, I usually go a little higher than what I need for that, just to make sure that I don't get any accidental motion blur in my photos. And when it comes to faster moving subjects like bicycles, for example, or cars, I usually use 1/500 or 1/1000. But you don't want to overdo it when it comes to a high shutter speed, because remember, the faster your shutter speed is, the less light comes into your camera. So if you have a shutter speed that is too high, you might end up with an image that is too dark. And then you'll have to compensate that lack of light by changing the aperture or your ISO, which can heavily impact the sharpness of your photo or the quality. So again, I suggest you use a shutter speed that is a little higher than what you need. And I'll talk about how to balance the 3 different settings at the end of this video, because for it to make sense, we need to firstly understand how aperture and ISO impact our photos. So next up is aperture, because that determines what in our photo is sharp and what isn't. So aperture describes how open your lens is, and how much light gets through your lens into your camera. And it's measured in f-stops, so the number with an f slash is the value for your aperture. And that usually ranges from f1.2, which is usually reserved for very expensive lenses, up to f22, which every lens can get to. And you can actually see how that works when you look at the aperture blades on your lens when your camera is turned on. So for example, if you turn your aperture down to f1.8 or f2.8, you'll see that the blades open up, meaning a lot more light comes in. And on the other hand, if you increase the aperture to something like f22, you'll see that the blades are closing and there's only a tiny opening left for the light to get through. But before you think, yeah, well, okay, in that case, I'll just use the lowest aperture and always get the most light in to make sure my image is bright enough. Be aware that there is a trade-off for lower apertures. And that is that they impact the depth of field. And depth of field describes how much of your photo is sharp. So a low aperture like f1.8, for example, will give you a very shallow depth of field, meaning that things in front of your subject and behind it will be blurry. And that is the effect that you often see in portraits, for example. And a lot of people find that pleasing to look at. A high aperture, on the other hand, like f5.6 or f8.11 and so on, will give you a deep depth of field, meaning that a lot of the things in your photo are sharp, if not everything. And that's what you usually want to use in landscape photography or in cityscape photography or even in street photography. To help you decide what aperture is right for you, you can ask yourself a question, and that is, do you want everything to be sharp or do you just want your subject to be sharp? I usually decide on my aperture based on the composition I've got. So if there's a lot going on around my subject and there's too many distractions, I do tend to use a lower aperture like f2.8 because that's the lowest my zoom lens will get to. And I don't want more bokeh than f2.8 gives me, to be honest. And usually I shoot from a distance that makes the things around my subject a little blurry, but it doesn't kind of shoot them into oblivion where you can't see what is going on around my subject. So that way I can still focus on my subject because it's the sharpest element. And the other supporting subjects, I'll call them, the things around my subject, they'll be a little unsharp, but you can still make out what they are and they can still give context to my subject, but they are not so distracting because they aren't super sharp. And in other cases, I do use an aperture like f5.6 or f2.8, but that's mostly the case when my composition is kind of clean and I don't have too many distracting elements. And in that case, I don't mind having a higher aperture that has everything in it sharp. Okay, so aperture helps you decide what in your image is sharp and what isn't, but it also impacts how much light gets into your camera. And sometimes you've got the right shutter speed and you've got the right aperture from a creative standpoint, but your image is still too dark. And in that case, you can use ISO to help your camera out and make the image brighter. Okay, so the thing with ISO is that it doesn't have a creative implication for your photos like shutter speed or aperture do, but it impacts how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So if you increase the ISO, your camera sensor gets more sensitive to light and the image becomes brighter. And ISO is just measured with a number. So it's ISO 100, which is most often the base ISO for modern cameras. And it goes up to astronomical numbers that you will never use. But the thing with ISO is that it helps you make your image brighter, but again, there is a trade-off, and that is the higher your ISO is, the more grainy your photos become. And unfortunately, it's not the good kind of grain that you know from film photos. It looks more like a digital noise kind of grain. And the thing is, a little noise in your photo is not the end of the world. So you don't always have to shoot at ISO 100 to prevent any grain. You just need to be aware that too high ISO leaves you with an image that has a very poor quality. And maybe the most important thing to remember with noise and ISO is that a noisy photo can be recovered quite easily, especially with Lightroom's denoise feature or any other software that has that feature. But a blurry photo will be a blurry photo and is often not recoverable. And I'm not sure if that's a word, but you know what I mean. Okay, so now that we've got a basic understanding of how these settings impact our photo, let's talk about how to balance them out. Okay, so 90% of the time I want to freeze motion. So I'm using a high shutter speed and a lower aperture to make sure my subject is sharp and things around my subject are kind of a little blurry, but still noticeable so my viewer can tell what they are looking at, and the things around my subject kind of give the viewer context. And if I want to make sure everything in my photo is sharp, I'll use a higher aperture. And in that case, usually the motion isn't too important, so I can use a slower shutter speed to use more or to get more light into my camera, because the high aperture gives me less light into my camera. And then lastly, once I've got my shutter speed and aperture dialed in, I'll use whatever ISO I need to get the image to the right exposure, so it's bright enough. And most of the time I'm using auto ISO with a maximum of 6400 because I know my camera can handle that much ISO. So if you're unsure how much ISO your camera can handle, I suggest the next time you go out shooting, you take the same photo with different ISO values to make sure you can check how much ISO is okay for you until it gets too much, and then set your maximum ISO to that. Alright, and that is it for the technical basics for photography. Again, this video is part of my beginner series for photographers, so if you don't want to miss the next video, make sure you subscribe and come back next Wednesday when I'll see you in the next video.